Hey everyone! So today we're going to talk about storytelling in photography. Now, photography is such a powerful communication tool. I'm sure you've all heard of the phrase, an image is worth 1,000 words. Well, there's a reason people say that. Usually you could communicate things that just aren't possible in any other way, but you can communicate this through photography. It is Another reason it's so powerful is that it really does transcend our differences. Whereas maybe there would be a communication barrier like distance or language or cultural differences, we can still communicate with other people through photography. So for a moment, let's put what we may think about immigration policies and politics aside and really look at this image. So when I'm looking at photos, I start to describe them because yes, our brain takes them in all of a sudden, but actually sitting here and describing it and forcing my brain to communicate with my mouth helps me really process what's going on. So let's look at this image. We have a woman here and she's running with a little girl or boy, can't really tell, but a woman here running with her children. We have another woman here running. She has a very worried look on her face. She's picking up this kid, in a very rough way. Like she has no choice but to pick her up like this. We have this smoke coming back here. I'm gonna guess it's from maybe like a tear gas canister and not a fire. We have a bunch of people out back here. Some people are wet. They're scrambling up this way. There's people helping other younger kids. There's another kid back here. It looks like there's someone back here maybe with something helping him walk. Okay, so this is a harrowing image. I mean, to be in a situation where you feel like you have no choice but to grab your children and run must be terrifying. I've never been in a situation like this where I felt like I had to pull someone next to me that I'm with and run with them. So I just don't even know how to. Wow. So I could read, and in fact, here's a link to the article where this photo came from, and I could read about this all day. But can I really feel or get close to feeling what these people are feeling without an image? This is really the power of photography. And that is empathy. So empathy is the ability to feel and understand what someone else is going through. So often we're quick to judge, especially nowadays with social media. We see someone doing something and it's just easy to just judge and say, why are they doing that? Or I would do it differently. But being able to put ourselves in someone else's position and their circumstances can really make us grow as human beings and care about each other more, which is, I think, something that's just completely essential for our species to continue on. So let's talk a bit about storytelling in photography. So you can tell stories in any genre in photography. In fact, if you learn how to tell stories, let's say in your portraiture, you're going to be a stronger portraiture photographer. The same with commercial photography and pretty much any photography. We as human beings love stories. That's why we love movies and books and shows and all of these things. We love stories. And so if you can learn how to use photography to tell a story, you will have really, really strong work. Now, despite this, there is some genres that are very specific to storytelling. So let's talk about these. We have documentary photography, photojournalism, street photography, and editorial photography. Now, a lot of these kind of intersect in a way, and we're going to talk about this. So let's just go over the basics really quick. Documentary photography the goal is to document people and events as they are. Photojournalism is a profession with very strict guidelines where you document major news events. So just right there, you can see that photojournalists also use documentary photography. Now, how they use documentary photography might be different than someone doing a personal project. Whereas with a documentary photographer, most of the time they aim not to change up the subject, not to direct anyone, not to interfere in a scene, but sometimes it still happens. With photojournalism, you cannot do that. Photojournalism is so strict with their ethics because we're counting on photojournalists to give us the truth. So, street photography are photos created in public spaces that aim to capture everyday life. So street photography is also documentary photography, but it's different than photojournalism because photojournalism is really about documenting major news events, whereas street photography is about capturing everyday life. Now, editorial photography are photos that help tell a story in print and online in a news or magazine article. So what's different about editorial photography and, let's say, photojournalism is that editorial photography, you do have some room to set up photo shoots and direct your subject. So what do I mean? So let's say, if you're working for a magazine and they're doing an article on traveling to Italy, then you can go take photos in a restaurant, ask someone to sit there eating. If you could take a photo of them, they can pose, no big problem. Now, if you were doing, if you were a photojournalist and you were going to Italy because there was a major conflict, let's say there was a strike, you wouldn't be able to go up to the strike workers and say, hey, can you pose this certain way? Because as a photojournalist, your job is to just report and be a witness to the truth. So editorial is still working with, magazines and creating images to create stories, but photojournalism is more about being in the moment and major news events. Okay, so first off, let's just talk about this image. This is an image by Louis Hine, and he took this here in the United States in the early 1900s. Now, this image and images that he took like it were completely instrumental in changing the laws around child labor. Up until this point, kids worked in factories, in coal mines, in the fields, that still happens sometimes, unfortunately, more in other countries, but we still have children working in the fields here too. But these photos are really pushed people to act and realize that this isn't okay. So documentary photography can have a huge impact. And by the way, Louis Hine, he wasn't a photographer by trade. He was really into social aspects. And so him picking up a camera, he used it as a tool to help him really push for rights for children so they didn't have to be workers anymore. So documentary photography can be documenting in the moment events such as mass shootings, natural disasters, crimes, or a story that takes longer to play out. So dealing with disease or tragedy, endangered animals, climate change, or everyday life. So you can see that documentary photography is like a style, and it really permeates through all these things, because if you're using documentary photography to document in the moment events like these, then we're talking about photojournalism. If you're talking about a story that takes longer to play out, then that's still documentary photography. And everyday life, we would usually call that street photography. So there's really not one, right or wrong on this. This is all documentary photography. The strictest aspect, which we'll get into in a moment, is photojournalism. So some documentary photographers interact with their subjects through interviews and may direct a subject for a photo, but of course this is a huge no-no for photojournalists. For stories that aren't about a single event, documentary photographers spend a lot of time with people. And when I say a lot of time, I mean maybe they're going and they're spending time with the same person 12 hours a day for a week straight, a month straight, a year straight. Sometimes it's a story that they come back to. So maybe they spend a week with a person, they have a photo story, and maybe even they've written a story about it, and then they go back and check with the person every couple years, every 5 years, every 10 years, something like that, to see how their story actually develops. So doing this allows the subject to become comfortable, because, you know, when someone first pulls out a camera, our first reaction is usually to like kind of pose or maybe smile or look away. I don't want you to take my photo, stuff like that. But as someone sits there, you start to forget about that. You're like, okay, it's over. They took their photos, and then they keep snapping away. So this helps a documentary photographer get past that first staged few minutes or hour or whatever it is of being around a person, until that person's facade kind of just falls away and the photographer is able to get some real unposed imagery. And one of the best tips out there actually came from a New York photojournalist during the 1930s and 40s. Ouija was his name, and his big tip was f8 and be there. So what does this mean? So an aperture of f8 is a medium aperture, which means that you're gonna have a decent amount of depth of field and still let some amount of light in, and at the same time, be there just means showing up. If you're there, you can catch the photo. So he was, he seemed to always know when the action was happening, and he was just on his game. He was listening to the police scanners, rushing off to scenes, and he was there for those big moments and took some pretty incredible photos. Okay, so at the end of each of these sections, I have included an optional video, which I think, these videos really will open your eyes to what these different type of shooting is about. So this one says photojournalism, but Renee Seebeyer, this video is really heartbreaking and eye-opening, where she goes and documents a mother as the mother's helping her son with his battle with cancer. And there are some very difficult images in this video, but I think they're pretty important to see and see the work that she has put into this. Okay, so let's talk about photojournalism. Now this image is by Baz Ratner for Reuters. This is from Afghanistan. And photojournalists really do some amazing work, because they have to keep calm and their composure in the midst of some insane situations. Now, imagine sitting there trying to decide what shutter speed you're trying to use and what position and what angle would be the best composition while there's stuff like this happening. It's mind-blowing for me. So photojournalism is a profession, and it has very, very strict ethical guidelines. Photojournalists are witnesses to these major events. They capture these images of historical and current events to relate the story to us, to their audience. So photojournalists are expected to photograph a story objectively as an eyewitness without conveying their own feelings about the story or what they think the story is. Now, as we're learning more about composition, this is pretty interesting, because I think you guys have kind of found out that choosing specific angles and lighting is going to change the communication of a photo. So photojournalists are expected to not put in their own feelings, but I think in a way that becomes almost impossible sometimes. I don't know. But where the really strict ethical guidelines come in, it comes in with how a photojournalist is engaging with the subjects that they are photographing. And in their editing. So when editing, photojournalists can make basic adjustments to photos such as exposure and contrast, but they cannot add, subtract, or change parts of an image. And for gear, it really varies widely. There's some photojournalists who are old school who just like going with the smallest film camera they can carry. But from what I've seen, most photojournalists are really trying to be ready for all situations. So they have different types of lenses, the different focal lengths. They have super wide to normal to telephoto. They carry multiple cameras because sometimes they don't have time to change a lens. It's just faster to have a camera for each lens instead. So they might have 3 cameras on. Sometimes they use tripods, sometimes it's just not possible, and a lot of photojournalists do carry some type of portable lighting such as flashes or LED lights. And to go back real quick to the lenses with a range of focal lengths. So when would this be important? Well, an image like this where you can't be close up, you definitely want a telephoto camera. But there's also times where maybe there's an interview happening in a small space and you need to photograph what's going on, and that's where something like a really wide lens would work well. So to work as a photojournalist, you must be part of a professional association and adhere to their guidelines. So let's take a quick look at one of these associations. So this is the Code of Ethics for the NPPA. And there is a link there if you guys want to read the entirety of it. But let's just look at some of these Code of Ethics real quick. All right, be accurate and comprehensive in the representation of subjects. Resist being manipulated by staged photo opportunities. Treat all subjects with respect and dignity. Do not pay sources or subjects or reward them materially for information or participation. Do not accept gifts, favors, or compensation. Do not intentionally sabotage the efforts of other journalists. It goes on and on. There's all kinds of different things. Let's see. Oh, look at this. Think proactively as a student of psychology, sociology, politics, and art to develop a unique vision and presentation. Work with a voracious appetite for current events and contemporary visual media. So it's not just about covering the story, it's about covering it in a great way that it's aesthetically pleasing at the same time. Avoid political, civic, and business involvements or other employment that compromise or give the appearance of compromising one's own journalistic independence. Strive to be unobtrusive and humble in dealing with subjects. So the unobtrusive part is not getting in their way and not affecting what they're doing because you have a camera. Oh, wow. So if you think that you want to be a photojournalist, more power to you, because it is such important work. I can't imagine doing it myself. I know just watching some of the videos that I've provided for you guys in this lecture makes me cry whenever I watch them. So yeah, but please feel free to check this out if you are interested. Okay, moving forward. So one more thing, let's take a look at, what happens, what you have to do to get fired as a photojournalist. And when you get fired as a photojournalist, it's not that you just get fired from a publication, you get banned. So you can no longer be a part of any of these associations. You can never work in that capacity ever again. So here, and wow, there's a lot of ads on this page. What happened here, Daily Mail? So here is the images. So this was a Pulitzer Prize winning photojournalist, and they took this photo, and in the original photo there is a video camera in there, and they decided to Photoshop it out. So when they did this, they breached the Code of Ethics Even though it wasn't necessarily, important to the story, it's still, there has to be a very high standard, because we are counting on photojournalists to give us the truth of what is really going on out there in the world. And so any type of lie is seen as a breach of ethics, and you can be banned from working in the field. So those of you thinking about going into photojournalism, keep this in mind. And even within the bounds of what you can change, let me switch off of that. Too many ads. There's still some issues. So I don't know if you guys remember, a lot of you might not be old enough, but there was a lot of controversy during the O.J. Simpson trial, because we have the exact same photo here, and they were edited very differently from one to the other. And so a lot of people said that this darker editing, which is still within the bounds of what you can edit the exposure, made it seem like he was more guilty. And that, according to the person who did the editing, that wasn't what they were trying to do, but they got a whole lot of backlash on this. Okay, so for this, I did put 2 videos here. Again, these are optional, but these videos are really heart-wrenching and will make you appreciate the awesome work that photojournalists are doing. Okay, so next let's talk about street photography. And we have this awesome photo by, let's see if I could say it, Photojournalism. So street photography are photos created in public places that aim to capture the human condition, or to capture an event as it's happening, but it's generally not a newsworthy event. So these are usually photos of everyday life, and some of these photos end up becoming significant over time, because we're showing how life was in a certain era, or maybe you're capturing a person and place that has significance later on. So some examples, there's some great images, like if you look back at photos from the 1900s and you're like, wow, that was really crazy how they used to live. Well, the photos you're taking right now, in the future, someone might look back at your photos and think the exact same thing. So these photos of everyday life can become really important to understanding how the past was. Another thing is, let's see, capturing a person or place that has significance later on. I knew a photographer who had captured Cesar Chavez, who was a political activist, and he specifically fought for farm laborers, for the workers' rights. And he photographed Cesar Chavez at a random event before he became really famous for what he was doing. So then years later, he goes back and he's looking through his film, and there's Cesar Chavez, who at that point had become a very significant person, especially in California history. So you never know. You never know who the people we're photographing may become famous, may become important. And that's one reason why I have a hard time deleting photos unless they're like horribly blurry or they're really, really bad. I tend to keep most of my photos for this exact reason. Now, some gear and tips that are a little bit different. So many street photographers prefer smaller, discreet cameras because they're trying not to get attention. So instead of sitting there and, like the documentary approach of a very specific thing that's happening, instead they are just waiting. So you pre-visualize by finding a great composition with great lighting and then waiting to see who comes through there. That's one way to go about getting some good photos. Another way is to spend time in a place so the people around you forget you, and then you get those natural unposed images. And I'll tell you that street photography is really fun just to play play with, just to kind of force you to get out there and take some photos. I love going to, random events and seeing what I can capture. And once again, we have a video here. This is an optional video on 23 ninja tips for your next photo walk. All right, last but not least, this is an image of Lizzo by Hope Williams, who shot her for Vogue. And we're going to talk a bit about editorial photography. So editorial photography are photos that help tell a story in print or online, in news or magazine articles. So these photos are used for informational or educational articles. So this isn't going to be so much about a very specific newsworthy event, like a bombing or something. This is going to be more, other types. So, and there is some differences, especially there's a fine line when it comes to editorial and commercial photography. We'll be talking about commercial photography in a few weeks, but simply put, commercial photography are images that are used to sell something. So you might be thinking, well, what about this? Isn't this being used to sell maybe the dress or the jewelry or an album? In a way, but this isn't an advertisement specifically for the dress. Yes, she's wearing it, and so in a way is endorsing it and selling it, because they're going to mention in the inside the cover that what dress she's wearing, but it's not an advertisement for that specific maker. Same with everything else. So this is a story about her, but it's not an advertisement for her music. You can see where that fine line is coming in, right? The other thing that really sets the two apart is the usage rights, which we will get into a bit more later on this semester. So, I'm trying to think of a better way to really tell you the differences. So she, if this was an advertisement for the dress, you'd have the name of the person, of the company and such, but this isn't what's happening here. So editorial is also a style. So you might hear people say, I'm an editorial photographer, or not editorial photographer, but I shoot an editorial style, which usually means they're trying to shoot in the moment instead of posing, and that they are using the light that's available and not adding any other light with like flashes or something. So this type of photography does have a great look to it. Now, I would say that there are some people out there that I've encountered and worked with who haven't quite worked on their posing and lighting skills, and so they opt to do this type of photography because of that. Not saying that this style isn't great. I mean, I shoot unposed photos where I don't have lighting all the time, but in some types of photography, I don't think it's really helpful. If you're gonna shoot a wedding, you want to capture their day as best as possible. So yeah, if you want to have some editorial style photos, have a second shooter maybe doing that, but you should still be posing the couple and adding lighting if necessary. That's my 2 cents. So really quickly, let's look at this. So we have, what is editorial photography? If it'll load. There we go. And this is really just talking about some of the different meanings. And I'll let you guys, if you're interested in this, come back and read this. This is a really great article that really sets apart some of the legal issues and such. But we're going to talk about the stylistic meaning real quick. So usually, like I said, editorial is meaning an unposed look. Now, a lot of photographers actually shoot editorial style, but it is posed. They do add lighting, and that's to further their communication. So let's look at these two group shots. So here, this is very clearly posed. Everyone's looking at the camera, right? In this shot, it doesn't feel posed, but it is. Okay, they directed the people to look a certain way, and they were able to capture this more natural feeling image. So if you're going to shoot editorial, I think this is more truer than what other, with the idea of, no, we're not going to use lighting, we're not going to use posing. For me, that's kind of a cop-out. Same with this. So they're both posed portraits, but this one doesn't feel posed. It feels like it's in the moment, taken in action. Okay. Again, if you want to go back to it, you can. And this is really great if you are interested in working in magazines. There's some really great tips in this article to get you started in there. All right, guys. So I hope this you enjoyed this lecture on storytelling and photography. We really just, hit the very tip of the iceberg. There's so much to know about this genre of photography. I hope that if you're interested, you'll really delve in, come back to this lecture, watch these videos, read these optional articles and such.